Welcome back. Tonight we're going to unravel one of the boldest acts of rebellion in American history, a protest so daring it helped ignite a revolution. This is the story of the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when a group of angry colonists, disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded British ships and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into Boston Harbor. But it wasn't really about the tea, it was about defiance. Fed up with unfair taxes and having no voice in British Parliament, these patriots sent a clear message: enough is enough. In just one night, they challenged an empire, triggered harsh retaliation from the Crown, and helped unite the colonies on the road to independence. But before we continue, I'd like you to take a moment and let me know. Where are you watching from? What time is it for you? Are you here to fall asleep, or just passing time while learning a little history? And if you enjoy the stories I tell, please consider liking and subscribing to support me in making more content like this. Now, let's get into it. The Boston evening air, sometime in the late 1760s, had a way of carrying tension. Not always loud or explosive, but persistent, like a storm just beyond the horizon. The war with France had ended not long ago, the one they called the 7 Years' War, and Britain had emerged technically victorious, but financially bruised. To the east, London's ministers were running columns of numbers and realizing just how expensive global power had become. And to the west, across an ocean that took weeks to cross, the colonies were humming with energy and growing more distant in spirit. That was where the problem began, in the quiet spaces between ledgers and loyalty. Britain needed money, and the colonies, it believed, were a convenient place to find it. After all, it was for their protection that the Crown had just spent years at war. The logic in Parliament seemed simple enough, but taxation is rarely simple when it is not chosen. It started with the Proclamation of 1763. On the surface, it looked like a protective measure. No settlements allowed west of the Appalachian Mountains, a buffer to avoid stirring more conflict with Native American nations. But to many colonists, especially the ones hungry for land, it felt like a leash. And more than that, it was the first sign that decisions about the colonies were going to be made far away, in rooms they would never enter. Then came the Sugar Act of 1764. It was a revised version of older trade laws, but with sharper teeth. It taxed molasses, a crucial ingredient in the rum trade, and it empowered British officials to clamp down on smuggling with stricter enforcement. Smuggling had long been a grey economy in the colonies, a quiet kind of rebellion that many considered a right. But now, it was being criminalised more aggressively. The next year, the Stamp Act arrived like a cannon blast. For the first time, the Crown imposed a direct tax on all printed materials, newspapers, contracts, licenses, even playing cards. The backlash was immediate and fierce. It wasn't just about the money, it was about representation. The colonists had no voice in Parliament, and yet they were being asked to pay for the machinery of empire. It was James Otis who coined the phrase that would echo across taverns and town halls: taxation without representation is tyranny. And then, quietly and relentlessly, the resistance began to organize. In taverns, where lanterns cast flickering shadows and ideas fermented alongside cider, groups like the Sons of Liberty started to form. Men like Samuel Adams, with his restless pen and burning sense of justice, became central figures in the growing movement. He wasn't a man of wealth, but his words moved crowds. His cousin, John Adams, was more careful, more legalistic, but equally committed to the cause of colonial rights. Then there was John Hancock, one of the richest men in Massachusetts, whose ships carried goods, and sometimes, according to British accusations, contraband, up and down the Atlantic coast. The resistance wasn't always loud. It was in the boycott lists, in the newspaper editorials, in the gatherings that called themselves committees of correspondence. These were the early arteries of rebellion, and they pulsed with suspicion. Suspicion that Britain wasn't just taxing goods, it was trying to shrink colonial autonomy. Parliament, to many, was behaving not like a governing partner, but a master. The Stamp Act Congress met in 1765, a rare show of unity among the colonies. Delegates from 9 of them came together in New York to draft petitions to the King and Parliament. It was polite, still respectful, but it was a warning. That same year, street protests broke out in Boston and elsewhere. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged or burned. One collector's home was ransacked. The fear began to run both ways. Eventually, the Stamp Act was repealed, but not without a bitter aftertaste. Parliament replaced it with the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That line, so absolute, so sweeping, felt like a loaded weapon waiting to fire. Meanwhile, the ideological lines were being drawn deeper. Pamphlets and sermons, letters and broadsides, they all carried the same underlying message. If liberty could be taken piecemeal, it would be gone before anyone realized it. It was in this fertile, dangerous soil that a true resistance began to grow, not just against taxes, but against the nature of British rule itself. What fascinates me about this period is how ordinary so much of it looked on the surface. No grand battlefields yet, no declarations of independence, just men and women waking up to the slow realization that their world was changing, that their loyalty was being tested, and that choices were being made for them by people an ocean away. It's easy to think of revolution as something sudden, dramatic, but often it begins with paperwork, with laws that feel just slightly wrong, and with the steady accumulation of quiet injustice. By the late 1760s, the question wasn't just whether Parliament could tax the colonies, it was whether it respected their rights as English subjects, or perhaps more accurately, whether they were even considered English subjects at all. That tension, the ambiguity of belonging, would only intensify as the Crown passed more laws and the colonies found their voice. The seeds had been planted, not by gunfire, but by ink, by silence, and by the creeping sense that something fundamental had shifted between the colonies and the empire that claimed to protect them. By the close of the 1760s, the colonies had become an increasingly restless collection of provinces, scattered along the Atlantic edge, but bound together by growing frustration. The Stamp Act may have been repealed, but its shadow lingered in the form of deeper mistrust. Parliament, facing mounting debts and pressured by powerful lobbies in London, turned its attention to a new set of policies, ones that seemed, on paper, both clever and tolerable. These were the Townshend Acts of 1767. Named for Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Acts sought to bypass colonial assemblies entirely. Duties were placed on a handful of everyday imported goods: glass, lead, paint, paper, and, perhaps most notably, tea. The logic was subtle, almost bureaucratic in tone. These were external taxes, levied not on internal transactions like the Stamp Act, but on trade. Parliament hoped the distinction would silence resistance. But this time, the reaction was not confusion or scattered outrage. It was organized, determined, and increasingly radical. In taverns thick with the smell of pipe smoke and ink-stained print shops where presses clattered through the night, resistance took root. One of the most influential voices was John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania lawyer who penned a series of essays titled Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. He wrote with measured calm, but every line carried weight. "We are taxed without our consent," he warned, "and we are therefore slaves." His essays spread across the colonies like wildfire, reprinted in countless newspapers, discussed in back rooms, and read aloud at candlelit meetings. Dickinson's choice of words, deliberate, sober, never inflammatory, made the message harder to dismiss. Even those still loyal to the Crown found themselves quietly nodding in agreement. The colonies began to act with one mind. Non-importation agreements, which boycotted British goods, took on a life of their own. These were not just pledges made by merchants in ledgers, but public rituals. Lists of who honoured the boycotts and who broke them were printed and shared. To buy British glass or lead was no longer just an economic choice. It became a political statement, one that could lead to social ostracism or even vandalism. In Boston, the center of the brewing storm, things moved quickly. The Sons of Liberty, now more organized and emboldened, became a quiet force behind much of the action. Though not officially sanctioned, they often operated with a strange blend of secrecy and visibility. Their warnings, nailed to doors or whispered in crowded markets, were unmistakable. British customs officials began to fear for their safety. One, Charles Paxton, kept pistols under his pillow. Customs enforcement itself had become more aggressive. The use of writs of assistance, broad search warrants that allowed officials to enter homes and shops without specific cause, felt to many like tyranny in its plainest form. Stories circulated of homes ransacked, crates broken open, tea and sugar confiscated without apology. The HMS Romney arrived in Boston Harbor in 1768, its presence looming and deliberate. It came to back customs officials and deter smuggling, but to the citizens watching from shore, it felt like a warship sent to police its own. That summer, tensions reached a new peak with the seizure of John Hancock's ship, the Liberty. Hancock, a wealthy merchant with both popularity and a flair for performance, was accused of smuggling. His ship was confiscated, and riots followed. Hundreds of Bostonians poured into the streets. Customs officials were pelted with stones, their homes attacked. Eventually, some fled to the safety of Castle William, a British fort on an island in the harbour. The line between protest and violence blurred. Parliament responded not with dialogue but force. 2 regiments of British troops were dispatched to Boston. Their arrival in the fall of 1768 changed the mood entirely. Redcoats marched through the streets, camped on the Boston Common, and were quartered near the very taverns where revolution simmered. Their muskets gleamed, their presence constant. There is something uniquely unsettling about soldiers stationed in a civilian city during peacetime. It was not only the sense of being watched, but the slow erosion of normalcy. A glance over the shoulder, a hushed tone when speaking near a uniform. The people of Boston, already wary of Parliament, now found themselves feeling occupied by their own empire. Samuel Adams, who rarely missed an opportunity to stoke the fire, began writing circular letters encouraging other colonies to stand in solidarity. The Massachusetts Circular Letter, sent to other colonial assemblies, called the Townshend Acts unconstitutional. Parliament demanded the letter be rescinded. When the Massachusetts Assembly refused, it was dissolved. That act, more than any speech or protest, told the people exactly how little their voice mattered to those across the sea. Still, the movement held to a certain discipline. Boycotts continued, local industries gained importance, and women, often left out of formal politics, stepped into their own roles. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty emerged, spinning homespun cloth, organizing tea alternatives, and creating quiet but powerful acts of defiance. Tea, once a symbol of civilized refinement, began to shift in meaning. To some, drinking it was an act of submission. Taverns offered Liberty tea, brewed from raspberry leaves or other herbs. A cup of real tea, imported and taxed, could now mark you as a loyalist. Even amid all this unrest, there were moments of quiet strategy. Behind closed doors, in dim parlours and above bustling shops, networks of correspondence began to flourish. Committees formed, writing letters to coordinate resistance across towns and colonies. These were the early whispers of what would become intercolonial unity. But under the surface, pressure continued to mount. As 1770 approached, it was becoming harder to pretend that all this could be resolved through dialogue. The British government, far removed from the daily rhythms of colonial life, viewed the resistance as arrogance and disobedience. The colonists, living under the gaze of bayonets, saw it as survival. And somewhere, amid the flickering candlelight and crumpled pamphlets, a deeper awareness was forming. That the rules had changed. That protest alone might no longer be enough. That something more, something louder, was waiting just beyond the horizon. It was just past dusk on a mild March evening in 1770 when the slow burn of tension in Boston finally found its spark. King Street, in the heart of the town, had been humming with unrest for weeks. The presence of British troops in the city had always felt intrusive to the colonists, but now it felt more like an occupation. Boots echoing on cobblestones, red coats glinting in firelight, muskets always close at hand. It created an atmosphere that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. The British soldiers had been stationed there since 1768, sent to enforce order as protests mounted against Parliament's taxes. But as more troops arrived, the friction with civilians only intensified. Skirmishes broke out in taverns and alleys. Children taunted soldiers on the streets. Local workers bristled at being replaced by off-duty soldiers looking for extra coin. It was a slow, relentless build-up, until everything tipped on the night of March 5th. No one planned what happened. That's what makes it so haunting. A British private named Hugh White stood guard outside the custom house that evening. A lone figure, his red uniform bright against the growing shadows. When a wigmaker's apprentice named Edward Garrick insulted one of White's superiors, the private lashed out and struck him with the butt of his musket. That single blow drew a small crowd, mostly young men and apprentices, noisy, angry, and hungry for justice. Church bells rang. Whether they were signalling fire or rallying more citizens, it worked. The crowd thickened quickly. Snowballs were thrown, then oyster shells, then chunks of ice. The soldiers called for reinforcements. Captain Thomas Preston arrived with 7 more men, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. They formed a defensive line in front of the custom house, trying to hold back the increasingly hostile crowd. Witnesses later described shouting, chaos, confusion. Cries of fire rang out. No one could agree where the command came from, but one soldier did fire, then another, then a third. In the space of mere seconds, 5 colonists lay dying in the snow. Crispus Attucks was among them. A man of African and Native American descent, he had worked as a sailor, and by some accounts, he had led the charge that night. He became the first to fall, and the first martyr in what would become a long struggle. His name doesn't always make it into school books, but his face appeared on pamphlets, coins, and abolitionist speeches decades later. Alongside him, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr were shot. Carr survived long enough to speak to a local clergyman, telling him that the soldiers had been provoked and should be forgiven. That detail often goes unmentioned in the broader narrative, but it matters. It shows how tangled this moment was. Not a clean tale of good versus evil, but something messier, more human. The immediate aftermath sent shockwaves through the city. The soldiers were arrested. Captain Preston turned himself in. The trial that followed became one of the most watched and debated events of the era. In a surprising twist, the defense attorney for the British soldiers was none other than John Adams, yes, the future president. He believed in the right to a fair trial, even for enemies, and feared what mob justice might mean for the fragile colonial sense of law and order. The courtroom was crowded and charged with emotion. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed the soldiers had been attacked and had no choice. Others swore the colonists were unarmed. Adams argued that facts must matter more than sentiment. And, in the end, the jury agreed. 6 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, branded on their thumbs with a hot iron, and released. The verdict didn't silence the anger, but it didn't explode into war either. For a brief moment, things quieted. Boston buried its dead, and the colonists carried on. But the scars remained. Paul Revere, the silversmith, engraved a dramatic depiction of the massacre not long after. You've probably seen it. Soldiers in perfect formation firing into an innocent crowd. It wasn't accurate, but it didn't have to be. It was effective. It stirred outrage. It simplified the narrative into one of tyranny and innocence. It was propaganda, and it worked. What fascinates me is how quickly people turned to art, to print, to image. As if the event alone wasn't enough. It needed to be shaped, told, remembered a certain way. It shows how early on, The revolution wasn't just about bullets and taxes, it was about stories, about symbols. After the massacre, British troops were withdrawn from the city. The colonial assemblies grew bolder. The Sons of Liberty became less a fringe group and more a symbol of organized resistance. And Boston, that small coastal town, became a symbol too, of sacrifice, of injustice, of something breaking apart. Years later, John Adams would reflect on that trial, calling it one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. He didn't regret defending the soldiers. He believed justice served a higher cause, that fairness and reason were the foundation of any true liberty. It's a striking perspective, especially when the world around him was charging headlong toward rebellion. If you walk along State Street today, there's a marker set into the pavement where the massacre happened. It's easy to miss. Cars pass by, tourists hustle toward Faneuil Hall. But sometimes, if you stop and listen, it almost feels like the street remembers, like the echo of footsteps or the weight of silence still lingers there. And that silence, it wasn't the end, it was only a pause. What followed wasn't a sudden burst of rebellion, but a slower, more calculated unraveling. Beneath the surface, resentment was hardening into strategy. In the spring of 1773, a new plan quietly moved through the corridors of British power. It wasn't a law that raised taxes or quartered soldiers, but it struck just as deep. Parliament passed the Tea Act, a piece of legislation that, on its face, looked harmless, even generous. It allowed the British East India Company, teetering on the edge of financial ruin, to sell its surplus tea directly to the colonies. The price would be lower than ever before. But that was the trick, because tucked into the folds of that act was a quiet assertion. The tax from the earlier Townshend duties still applied. It wasn't removed. So every sip of that discounted tea came with a silent surrender, an acceptance that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies without their consent. That's what made it unbearable. To the British, it was economic logic. To colonial merchants, it was sabotage. Local importers who had been smuggling Dutch tea, an open secret in every port, now faced ruin. Legal tea would undercut their prices, backed by imperial muscle. And to the people on the street, it wasn't about leaves in crates anymore. It was about principle, identity, dignity. The fear was that if this passed unchallenged, then anything might. Ships were already on the water, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver. East India Company vessels carrying tons of tea were bound for Boston, among other colonial ports. And in every town, from Charleston to Philadelphia to New York, the message was forming: don't let them unload. In many places, resistance worked without incident. In Philadelphia, protesters simply blocked the ships from docking. In New York, the vessels turned back. In Charleston, the tea was seized and left to rot in damp storehouses. But Boston was different. Boston was already smouldering from years of occupation, from blood on the snow. And the royal governor there, Thomas Hutchinson, refused to bend. Hutchinson was no stranger to colonial fury. A few years earlier, his house had been ransacked during Stamp Act protests, furniture smashed, manuscripts stolen, family terrified. He had rebuilt his political standing slowly, cautiously, but by 1773, he was firm in his belief that royal authority had to hold, and he was not about to let 3 ships simply sail away without delivering their cargo. So he ordered the ships to remain, and by law, after 20 days in port without unloading, their cargo would be seized and taxes collected by default. That clock started ticking the moment the Dartmouth dropped anchor in Boston Harbor on November 28th. Inside the city, discussions turned into debates, and debates into warnings. At the Old South Meeting House, just steps from where sermons and town business were usually held, thousands gathered. Men stood shoulder to shoulder on creaking wooden floors, arguing, demanding, planning. The Sons of Liberty were there, of course, but also merchants, shipbuilders, apprentices, even clergymen, all trying to find a way to say no without sparking a war they weren't sure they could win. Samuel Adams rose often to speak, his voice sharp, deliberate. "This meeting," he said, again and again, "can do nothing more to save the country. It became a kind of refrain, a way of saying, we've tried everything, and yet the tea remained. Meanwhile, secret committees met in taverns and quiet homes. They watched the harbour master. They tracked British patrols. They scribbled notes under candlelight, folded them twice, and passed them through trusted hands. If the governor would not let the ships leave, then perhaps the tea itself had to go. It's easy sometimes to forget how tense those final days were, not just politically, but emotionally. Families divided over what to do, shopkeepers worried about retaliation, young men whispered about disguises. It wasn't just a protest anymore, it was an unknown step into something no one could predict. One move too far, and there might be blood again. And then, December 16th arrived. The 20-day deadline had come. The city held its breath. That afternoon, over 5,000 people filled the Old South meeting house once more. Voices rang out from the gallery, echoing off wooden beams. Hutchinson remained unmoved. No ship would leave without unloading. And outside, the air had begun to shift. The kind of weight in the sky that tells you a storm is coming, even without thunder. At dusk, the meeting adjourned. Adams gave one final signal. "This meeting," he said again, "can do nothing more to save the country." The crowd stirred, and from the streets, a cry was heard, sharp, urgent. "That's enough!" someone yelled, and the streets of Boston began to move, but not in chaos, in coordination. Groups of men, somewhere between 30 and 130, depending on whose account you believe, gathered quickly and with eerie calm. Many had soot-darkened faces or wore blankets over their shoulders. Some bore feathers, not in mockery, but as a thin disguise meant to evoke Mohawk warriors. It wasn't meant to fool anyone. It was a symbol, a borrowed mask for an act they saw as both radical and ritual. They marched down to Griffin's Wharf in silence. No torches, no guns, only axes, crowbars, and determination. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, all moored quietly in the harbour, their holds heavy with crates. One by one, the men boarded. The ship's captains offered no resistance. Neither did the few customs agents on hand. They knew this was bigger than them. And then, methodically, deliberately, the men opened the chests, 342 in total, and spilled them into the dark water. The smell of salt and tannin rose into the night air. The harbour water turned inky, swirling with soaked leaves. The sound wasn't loud, no shouting, no violence, just the steady thud of wood against hull, the splash of cargo meeting tide. Onlookers watched in stunned silence. There were children in the crowd, eyes wide, clinging to their mothers' skirts. A few witnesses later said the harbour smelled of tea for days afterward. No one was hurt, nothing was stolen. Even a padlock broken during the action was later replaced by one of the protesters. It was destruction, yes, but precise, intentional. It was meant to send a message. We are not vandals. We are not criminals. We are subjects who refuse to be slaves. And when it was done, they vanished. Back into the streets, back into the taverns, back into anonymity. The ships floated lighter. The harbour was calm, but nothing about that night was ordinary again. That silence, it wasn't the end. It was only a pause. In the years that followed, the tension didn't vanish. It shifted, hardened, took new forms. The massacre may have faded from immediate memory, but the resentment it stirred never really left the city's air. Boston remained a place where whispers turned quickly into actions, where committees of correspondence spread word across the colonies, and where men gathered in candle-lit rooms to debate the meaning of liberty. By 1773, one issue rose above the rest: tea. Not the drink itself, of course, but what it represented. Parliament had passed the Tea Act in May of that year, aiming to rescue the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. The price of tea actually went down, but the catch was buried deeper. Buying it meant acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies. It was a clever trap, and the colonists saw it for what it was: In Boston, the resistance began to move not in mobs, but in meetings. And in those rooms, the Sons of Liberty, a loosely organized, often secretive group, began to coordinate a response. Samuel Adams, as always, was in the thick of it. Alongside him, men like Dr. Joseph Warren and Paul Revere kept the communications flowing. Letters were carried by hand, in secret, across town and across colonies. Every town meeting, every pamphlet, every whispered conversation in taverns like the Green Dragon carried a charge, the sense that something was building. The tea ships arrived in Boston Harbor in late November. The Dartmouth was the first, followed by the Eleanor and the Beaver. Under the law, the ships had 20 days to unload and pay the duty. But the merchants and citizens of Boston refused to allow the tea to be landed. No one wanted to touch it, and the customs officials couldn't seize it. The cargo just sat there, waiting as the clock ticked. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a loyalist through and through, refused to let the ships depart. He insisted the tea must be unloaded and the tax paid. Behind closed doors, the Sons of Liberty grew more agitated. The Old South Meeting House became their rallying point, a place where crowds, sometimes numbering over 5,000, gathered to hear fiery speeches and weigh options. Some of those debates must have felt chaotic. Voices rising, fists pounding on pews, the creak of old wooden floorboards beneath restless feet. There were moderates who still hoped for compromise, merchants who worried about retaliation, young radicals who wanted something more dramatic, and always the watchful eyes of British informants lurking somewhere in the crowd. In early December, a quiet plan began to take shape. It's not entirely clear who proposed it first. That's part of the myth, part of the mystery. But someone suggested direct action, not violence, not destruction, but a very precise, very public protest. The details were shared only with those who needed to know, and the instructions were clear. No weapons, no theft, no harm to the ships, only the tea. They called themselves Mohawks that night, though the disguises were more symbolic than convincing. Some wore blankets, soot on their faces, feathers tied into their hair. It was less about pretending to be native and more about claiming a kind of American identity, something apart from Britain, something born of the land. December 16th came, a day of rain and wind. At the Old South Meeting House, the crowd swelled again. They waited for news. Would the tea be sent back to London? Would Hutchinson relent? As the meeting dragged on into evening, no answer came. The final attempt to negotiate had failed. Then, someone, perhaps Samuel Adams, perhaps not, gave a signal, a shout. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." That's when the group moved. Roughly 100 men, maybe more, stepped into the cold and made their way toward Griffin's Wharf. Quietly, swiftly. The harbour was dark, the ships bobbing gently in the tide. They climbed aboard the Dartmouth first, then the Eleanor, then the Beaver. There was no resistance, no soldiers, no violence, just a quiet rhythm of work, men hauling chests of tea from the hold, breaking them open and dumping the contents into the harbour below. The smell of salt and wet tea leaves filled the air. Hours passed, but they worked steadily, methodically. 342 chests in total, the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars worth of tea. Some accounts say they swept the decks after, leaving the ships clean. Not a single tool or item was stolen, not even a lock was broken unnecessarily. Witnesses watched from the shore in stunned silence. Some loyalists were horrified. Others, even if they disapproved, couldn't help but admire the precision. One man, watching from a nearby building, later wrote, "It was the most orderly riot I ever saw." No one was arrested that night. No names were given. The participants vanished into the city, into alleys and back doors, and the harbour waves closed over the tea. By dawn, it was done. In the days that followed, Governor Hutchinson fumed. British newspapers decried the vandalism, calling the colonists savages. But in Boston, something had changed. There was a calm in the city, not one of peace, but of resolve. People understood the stakes. They knew the response from Britain would be severe. But they had drawn a line, a clear, irreversible line. I often wonder about the quiet after that night, the stillness of Boston Harbor, the scent of tea lingering on the wind, the strange mix of exhilaration and fear that must have hung over the city. History remembers the Boston Tea Party as a bold act of defiance, but to those who lived through it, it was a gamble, a leap into the unknown, and the price would soon be made clear. The retaliation came not with cannon fire or marching troops, but with paper, wax seals, and the heavy authority of Parliament. Word of the Boston Tea Party reached London in January 1774, nearly 6 weeks after the chests had sunk into the harbour. The response was immediate, calculated, and, at least from the British point of view, designed to crush the rebellion in its cradle. They called them the Coercive Acts. In Boston, they were quickly renamed the Intolerable Acts. The first was the Boston Port Act. It closed the harbour entirely, effective June 1st, 1774. No ships in or out, no goods traded, no livelihood for the many families who depended on Boston's bustling maritime economy. The punishment fit the crime in the eyes of Parliament. But it wasn't just punishment, it was isolation. Starve the city of commerce and you break its will. But that's not what happened. Instead, food and supplies began pouring in from other colonies. Rice from South Carolina, flour from Pennsylvania, sheep from Connecticut. The sense of unity, still fragile until then, began to solidify. People who had once thought of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers started thinking of themselves, hesitantly, as something more connected. But the British weren't finished. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which revoked the colony's charter. Town meetings, those loud, contentious, wonderfully chaotic expressions of local power, were now illegal unless approved by the royal governor. No more electing councils or sheriffs. From now on, appointments came from London. The people were to be ruled, not heard. The third blow was the Administration of Justice Act. If a British official was accused of a crime while enforcing imperial law, he could be sent to England for trial. Colonists called it the Murder Act, fearing that soldiers could kill with impunity, knowing they'd never face a jury of locals. And then there was the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house British troops, even in private homes if necessary. That fear, the knock on the door, the redcoat in the hallway, sank deep into the American imagination. It wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about intrusion, control, and dignity. To add insult to injury, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act around the same time, extending Canada's boundaries southward and granting rights to French Catholics there. It had nothing to do with Boston directly, but colonists viewed it suspiciously as another sign that their liberties were expendable, their voices ignored. Thomas Gage, a seasoned British general, was appointed military governor of Massachusetts. He arrived in May, replacing Hutchinson, and brought with him more troops, more order, and far less patience. Boston began to feel like a city under siege, though no battles had yet been fought. And still, the people resisted, not with muskets, not yet, but with ink, with meetings, with pledges and plans whispered over flickering candles. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the First Continental Congress. It was a moment no one had truly anticipated just a year earlier. Representatives who had never met before, men from the rice fields of Georgia and the shipyards of New England, sat together and tried to speak with one voice. They didn't call for independence, not yet, but they did agree on something radical. A united boycott of British goods, beginning December 1st. They drafted a declaration of rights and grievances and sent it to the king, still hoping for reconciliation, but preparing for something more. In Boston, meanwhile, defiance turned practical. The Committee of Donations, formed to distribute the aid pouring in from other colonies, became a lifeline. Small communities sent whatever they could. A woman in Connecticut sent a single blanket, wrapped carefully, with a note that read, "I send this as a sister to those who suffer for freedom." Those kinds of gestures, quiet, deeply personal, held the city together. But not everyone was united. Loyalists, sometimes called Tories, remained vocal in their support of the crown. Some feared anarchy more than tyranny. Some had personal or financial ties to Britain they couldn't afford to sever. The city's social fabric began to strain under the weight of suspicion and fear. Neighbours stopped speaking. Families split over loyalties. One Boston merchant, Richard Clark, who had agreed to receive the East India Company's tea, was so harassed that he eventually fled the city. The British presence only worsened the atmosphere. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Supplies were limited. Every step forward by the resistance seemed to invite more crackdowns. Yet, in the shadows, plans continued. Paul Revere, who'd helped spread the alarm after the Tea Party, remained active. He travelled between cities, carrying messages, maps, and news. His name would become legend later, but in these months, he was simply part of a larger network, a thread in the growing fabric of resistance. One account that always stays with me comes from the diary of a Boston teenager, Anna Green Winslow. She wrote of watching soldiers march past her window and wondering aloud if war would come to her street. Her entries mix everyday concerns with flickers of dread, as though even children could feel the slow tilt towards something irreversible. This was the quiet storm before the thunder. The Boston Tea Party hadn't ended anything. It had begun everything. It was the stone thrown into a still pond, and now the ripples were touching every shore. And for Britain, the reaction was rooted in a kind of disbelief. How could subjects of the crown, however distant, act with such defiance and expect no reprisal? But for the colonists, the reprisal proved the point. They were not citizens, they were subjects. And subjects had no voice. That distinction, citizen versus subject, would soon become the moral backbone of a revolution. The backlash came swiftly, and it was cold, calculated, and without mercy. In London, news of the Boston Tea Party landed like a thunderclap. What had unfolded in Boston Harbour was not seen as a clever protest or a political statement. It was, in the eyes of Parliament, vandalism, a direct assault on imperial authority. The King, George III, reportedly said, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." That sentiment settled into the corridors of Whitehall and hardened British policy toward the colonies. In early 1774, the Coercive Acts were introduced. The name itself, coercive, gives away the intent. These weren't just laws, they were punishments. The first and most immediate was the Boston Port Act. Effective June 1st, it ordered the closure of Boston Harbour until the East India Company was fully compensated for the lost tea, all 342 chests of it, valued at nearly £10,000. That meant no ships in or out, no goods, no fishing, no trade. For a city so tied to its port, it was economic strangulation. You can almost picture the docks falling silent, the planks rotting under salt air and idleness, fishermen staring out at water they couldn't work, merchants watching their livelihoods dry up, tavern doors swinging open to emptier rooms, the hum of commerce replaced with whispered outrage. Boston became a city under siege, not by armies, but by law. But Parliament didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act followed, effectively revoking the colony's charter. Town meetings, the same kind where citizens had debated taxes, rights, and tea, were now restricted. Most colonial officials would no longer be elected, but appointed by the Crown. It was a direct assault on local self-governance, and it sent a chilling message to every colony: defy us, and we will take away your voice. The Administration of Justice Act, often called the Murder Act by colonists, may have been the most alarming. It allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain or another colony. To many, this read as a license for British soldiers to commit violence with impunity. Justice, they feared, would no longer live in the same city as the people. And then came the Quartering Act. While not technically new, an earlier version had existed for years. This one gave broader power to house British troops in private homes and buildings without consent. It made people uneasy. Even if it wasn't often enforced to its full extent, the idea that the military could force its way into your space, your life, it lingered. Together, These became known in the colonies as the intolerable acts. I always find that word, intolerable, a deeply human one. It's not just about legality or policy, it's about what people can bear, what crosses the line from uncomfortable to unacceptable. And for many in the colonies, this was the moment when that line was not just crossed, but obliterated. Still, something remarkable happened in response. Boston didn't fold. It leaned into the hardship, and in doing so, became a symbol. Other colonies, even those that had once viewed Boston's radicals with suspicion, now saw the city as a martyr to imperial cruelty. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses declared June 1st, the day Boston Harbor closed, as a day of fasting and prayer. It was a quiet, solemn act of solidarity, but one that rang out across the colonies. Goods and supplies were sent north to help Boston's struggling families. Grain from Pennsylvania, rice from the Carolinas, cash donations and letters of encouragement. It's in these small, sometimes overlooked gestures that you can see the early threads of unity, the formation of a collective identity that hadn't quite existed before. 13 distinct colonies, each with its own economy, culture, and grievances, began to see themselves as tied together in something larger. This shift in perspective was crucial, and so was the way leaders responded. In September of 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. It wasn't yet a government, not in the way we'd think of one today, but it was something new. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia abstained for now, gathering to coordinate a unified response. They didn't call for war, not yet. They called for rights, for petitions, for recognition, but they also prepared, quietly. They drafted the Suffolk Resolves, which called for the rejection of the coercive acts, the mobilization of militias, and the suspension of trade with Britain. It wasn't revolution, but it was resistance with teeth. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, British troops began to entrench themselves more deeply. General Thomas Gage, now the military governor, fortified Boston and prepared for unrest. But the real danger, for him and for the crown, wasn't the crowds in the city anymore. It was what was happening quietly in the countryside, in barns, in forests, in the homes of farmers and tradesmen. Men began to drill in secret. Old muskets were cleaned, powder was gathered, and messages passed along winding colonial roads. A sense of waiting settled over the land, waiting for something to break, for someone to fire the first shot. The Boston Tea Party had not started the war, but it had made peace far harder to imagine. I often think about the people caught in the middle, the ones who didn't throw tea or pass laws, the shopkeepers whose goods sat unsold, the dock workers with calloused hands but no wages, the widows renting out rooms to strangers, hoping the soldiers wouldn't knock on their doors next. History, especially when told in broad strokes, can make it seem like events moved swiftly, inevitably. But this was a slow tightening, like a storm brewing just offshore, its edge creeping closer with each new policy, each new protest, each silence that followed. And yet, despite the anxiety, there was still hope. Hope that perhaps this could be resolved with words, with negotiation. That maybe the king hadn't heard the whole story. That maybe Parliament could be swayed. But those hopes were growing fainter by the day. In taverns and town greens, talk of rights was beginning to share space with talk of weapons. The lines were being drawn not just on parchment, but on the land itself. What began as protest was turning, step by step, into preparation for something no one had truly wanted, but many had come to expect. The harbour was still. The waters that once swallowed crates of tea now reflected a city under siege. Boston, once a centre of maritime commerce and noisy docks, had turned into a guarded shell of itself. By the spring of 1774, its shoreline wasn't bustling with the clatter of cargo or the bickering of merchants, but with silence and suspicion. The British blockade had choked off trade under the Boston Port Act, and hunger crept into neighbourhoods that had always relied on imported goods. But something else had taken root too, an unspoken commitment, among colonists near and far, that Boston would not face this alone. Across the colonies, there was a noticeable shift. Sympathy turned into strategy. The Tea Party, once viewed by some as an audacious act, was now seen as a line in the sand. The coercive acts, passed in retaliation, did more than punish a rebellious town. They galvanized an entire continent. Colonies that had previously stood on the sidelines began to send food, supplies, and letters of support. Charleston sent rice, Maryland flour, even the backwoods of Pennsylvania delivered livestock and firewood to feed Boston's poor. And in September of that same year, 1774, for the first time in history, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered, not in London or under the Union Jack, but in Philadelphia. It was called the First Continental Congress, and it wasn't just symbolic. It was a declaration of unity, of shared grievances, and of quiet resolve. Inside Carpenter's Hall, delegates debated by candlelight. The room echoed with voices from New York, South Carolina, Virginia, and beyond. There was still caution, of course. Some urged reconciliation, others spoke more boldly. But what they all agreed on was this: the colonies had to stand together. Out of that meeting came a powerful document, the Suffolk Resolves, which essentially called the coercive acts unconstitutional and urged people to arm themselves for resistance. Even George Washington, who had not yet taken up arms, called the Boston Port Act an invasion of our rights and privileges. There's something surreal about the idea that in taverns and town halls, whispers of war began to mix with the ordinary business of daily life. Across New England, militia companies began to drill with renewed seriousness. Not formal soldiers, not yet, but farmers, blacksmiths, and schoolteachers. They cleaned old muskets, repaired powder horns, and passed word through networks that stretched from the cities to the rural hills. Some of these militias had names, like the Minutemen, men sworn to be ready at a moment's notice. They weren't coordinated by a central army. They were bound instead by community, by habit, and by a growing sense that the government in London was no longer acting as a distant protector, but as an occupying force. For many, the line between protest and preparation had quietly dissolved. Stockpiling began in earnest. Ammunition, gunpowder, cannons, hidden in barns, sheds, and church cellars. The British military, well aware of the whispers, kept their own ears to the ground. General Thomas Gage, stationed in Boston and newly appointed as military governor of Massachusetts, began sending scouts into the countryside to map the roads and locate colonial armories. One of those secret stockpiles was in Concord, a small town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. And though it was peaceful on the surface, the town had become something of a nerve center for rebel planning. Gage saw it as a threat. The colonists saw it as a necessity. That's the thing about revolution. It never starts with grand declarations, but with quiet preparation and a creeping sense that tomorrow will not look like yesterday. There's a letter that sometimes goes unnoticed in the larger story. It was sent by Benjamin Franklin in early 1775, just weeks before everything would change. He wrote from London, still hopeful that the crisis might be diffused. The madness of the present measures, he said, may yet be checked, if only reason could find a foothold. But reason had long since begun to lose its grip. The shift from resistance to rebellion wasn't marked by a formal speech or a voted resolution. It was marked by the feeling, the certainty even, that words were no longer enough. That feeling thickened in the air like approaching thunder. The tea in Boston Harbor hadn't just stained the water, it had seeped into the foundation of an entire imperial relationship. It's easy, looking back, to assume everyone was on board with the coming conflict. But there was still fear, still reluctance. Many colonists had family ties to Britain. Some had served in British regiments during the French and Indian War. And for every Samuel Adams or Patrick Henry, there were dozens who were unsure, who wanted justice but dreaded war. Even so, the road was set. The Continental Congress agreed to a full boycott of British goods. They called it the Continental Association. Local committees were tasked with enforcement, and in some towns, these committees wielded more power than the colonial governors themselves. Social pressure became a tool. Those who violated the boycotts were sometimes publicly shamed or ostracized. One merchant in New Jersey found his shop windows shattered and a notice nailed to the door. "No friends of tyranny here." It's chilling how fast a protest movement can transform. What started as resistance to taxes became a test of loyalty. Neighbor watched neighbor. Taverns became places not just for ale, but for rumors and rumors of betrayal. In early 1775, word spread of British plans to march on Concord and seize the weapons hidden there. No one knew exactly when. But the roads outside Boston were under watch. Riders and messengers were prepared. It was a fragile equilibrium, tense, quiet, but on the verge of snapping. If you stood on a New England hillside in those final days of peace, you might have heard birdsong, maybe the creak of a cartwheel. But underneath that normalcy, there was movement. Unmarked wagons carrying powder barrels, lantern signals in high windows, quiet rehearsals in empty fields. It all looked so ordinary on the surface. But under that surface, revolution was breathing. Some of the loudest moments in history are carried not by the figures we see in portraits or the ones whose names echo in textbooks, but by those who moved through shadows, uncelebrated, unrecorded, yet indispensable. As the Boston Tea Party stirred the Atlantic and set the colonies on a collision course with empire, the story was quietly shaped by people who rarely found their way into the spotlight. Let's begin with a man who did, briefly, rise into view: Crispus Attucks. A man of African and native descent, Attucks had been born into a society that placed him at the outer edges of citizenship, yet his name is remembered as the first to fall in the Boston Massacre of 1770. His death became a rallying cry for patriots, but his life, as a dock worker, a fugitive slave, a man who navigated both the maritime world and the city's racial boundaries, speaks to the broader involvement of free and enslaved Black Americans in the revolutionary tide. Some historians have suggested that Attucks may have deliberately positioned himself at the front of the protest, knowing the risk. In that moment, his resistance became physical and immediate. And while the night of the Tea Party featured no bloodshed, Black Bostonians were certainly present, in the labor networks along the docks, in the taverns where intelligence passed hand to hand, and among those who offloaded, loaded, and guarded the very goods at the heart of protest. They were part of the fabric of a revolutionary city, yet their names were often left out of official minutes and published accounts. One man, David Walker, though a generation later, would reflect bitterly on how America was born in cries for liberty while holding tight to the chains of slavery. That contradiction had already begun to take root in 1773. Women too, though barred from formal politics, wove themselves into the resistance. Their hands stirred the boycott movement, refusing British tea long before it spilled into the harbour. Abigail Adams once urged her husband to remember the ladies, but many women didn't wait to be remembered. In Boston, households that refused imported tea did so not only out of patriotism, but as acts of economic pressure. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty organised spinning bees and homemade textile production to reduce reliance on British goods. They were creating a kind of domestic defiance, transforming the kitchen and loom into tools of rebellion. There are anecdotes, whispered through generations, of women listening through the floorboards of taverns, relaying conversations heard in confidence, passing messages hidden in baskets or folded into laundry lines. One such figure, Rachel Revere, the wife of Paul Revere, is said to have smuggled vital letters past British patrols. Her actions didn't make the broadsheets, but they made a difference. Then there were the merchants, and their motivations were not always so noble. The Tea Act, for all its imperial overreach, offered cheaper tea than what many Boston merchants could afford to sell. And so the protest, in part, shielded the economic interests of a local elite whose profits depended on smuggling and control of trade. John Hancock, often lionized for his flamboyant signature and patriot zeal, was also a wealthy smuggler whose cargoes had run afoul of British customs long before politics made it fashionable. For men like Hancock, liberty and ledger were intertwined. Smuggling, in fact, was a quiet engine of the colonial economy. British law prohibited the direct import of many goods from foreign ports, but the reality was more porous. Merchants in Boston, Newport, and Charleston regularly dealt in Dutch tea, Caribbean sugar, and French wines, often greased by bribes or false manifests. The East India Company's monopoly, reinforced by the Tea Act, threatened that grey economy. To protect it, some merchants lent both money and muscle to the cause of resistance, not purely out of principle, but preservation. It's tempting, sometimes, to imagine the Boston Tea Party as a spontaneous eruption of public will, a kind of thunderclap that cracked the imperial sky. But in truth, it was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre. Many of those who carried out the raid had ties to the Sons of Liberty, who operated more like a secret society than a grassroots movement. They held private meetings, used coded language, and deployed intimidation when persuasion failed. There are records, fragile and half-buried, of those who opposed the Tea Party and paid dearly. Loyalist merchants who supported the Crown's trade policies found their windows smashed, their reputations destroyed. In some towns, they were tarred and feathered, a punishment as public as it was cruel. One Boston merchant, Richard Clark, who tried to receive a shipment of tea, found his home surrounded by angry crowds, his family threatened, his livelihood shattered. He later fled to England, bitter and bankrupt. His voice is rarely heard in patriotic accounts, but his experience was real. And not every colonist supported the destruction of the tea. Some worried that lawlessness, even in the name of liberty, would provoke a crushing retaliation, which it did. Others feared that rebellion would spiral into chaos. A pamphlet circulated in early 1774 questioned whether destroying private property could ever be justified, even under the banner of protest. Its author remains anonymous, likely out of fear. But history has a strange gravity. Certain stories rise while others sink. The Tea Party became a symbol because it was bold, clean, and dramatic, but the truth beneath it was layered, a mix of ideology, economics, fear, and performance. Even among the protesters, there were disagreements. Some objected to the use of disguises, feeling it tainted the moral clarity of the act. Others worried that violence, even symbolic, could harden British resolve. There's even evidence that some men were drunk, not in a celebratory way, but stumbling under the weight of what they'd just done. One account from a local carpenter recalls seeing a man cry into his sleeve as he watched the harbour turn dark with tea. "It was done," he said, "but I cannot say I was proud." What's also often forgotten is that some of the tea thrown into the harbour may not have sunk entirely. Chests cracked open on impact, and loose tea floated like oil across the bay, staining the water with a bitter perfume. The next morning, townsfolk walked along the docks, scooping up handfuls of wet tea leaves, unsure whether to keep them, burn them, or let them drift back into the sea. These smaller details, the ones that don't always make the page, hold something essential. They remind us that history is not just a procession of dates and declarations, but of people, complicated, contradictory, courageous, and sometimes afraid. Patriots and profiteers, radicals and realists, all moving along the same narrow streets with different reasons for being there. By the time the final echoes of tea barrels splashing into Boston Harbor had faded, something deeper than defiance had begun to take root. The Boston Tea Party was more than a protest. It had the strange weight of prophecy, like the first toll of a bell that would not stop ringing. And even though those who tipped the chests overboard on that December night in 1773 could not have imagined the full scope of what was to come, their actions cast a long and stubborn shadow across the future. In the months that followed, the Tea Party quickly became both symbol and signal, not just for the colonies, but for the broader human impulse to resist power when it begins to grind too heavily against the soul. At first, Britain viewed the protest as a crime against its commercial interests, an affront that had to be punished. But for many in the colonies, it came to represent something sacred, the right to challenge authority without needing permission. The event wasn't always revered. For decades, it was spoken of in relatively modest terms. It wasn't until the decades after the American Revolution that the Tea Party began to take on a more mythic glow. By the 1830s, school books and speeches began describing the event with a tone of almost theatrical reverence. It was no longer just a local protest, but a bold and principled stand, a moment when ordinary people had risked everything to defend their liberties. That framing grew stronger with time until the Boston Tea Party became one of the foundational stories of American identity. There's an interesting shift that happens when a moment passes from history into mythology. The rough edges are softened, the contradictions are polished away, and eventually, what remains is not so much a record of what happened, but a reflection of what people wish had happened. That's part of the Tea Party's strange legacy, how easily it can be reshaped depending on who is invoking it. Take, for instance, how the phrase Tea Party was resurrected in modern political movements. In 2009, over 2 centuries after the last crate of East India Company tea sank beneath Boston's icy waters, a new Tea Party emerged. This time as a political coalition in the United States, rallying around small government and anti-tax ideals. Protesters wore tricorn hats and waved signs quoting the Founding Fathers. They invoked the 1773 protest to justify a range of positions, some of which the original participants would likely have found puzzling. This reinterpretation wasn't an isolated moment. Throughout American history, the Tea Party has been revisited, repackaged, and reimagined, used by abolitionists, suffragettes, labor organizers, and even environmental activists as a metaphor for standing up to unjust systems. Frederick Douglass once praised the Tea Party as a moment when men made laws for themselves, tying it to the larger struggle for human rights. Susan B. Anthony drew parallels between the Sons of Liberty and the women's suffrage movement. They were all, in her view, fighting for voices that had been denied a place in the conversation. Even outside of America, the symbolism echoed. The very idea of dumping an unwanted commodity into a harbour as an act of protest has inspired echoes from India to South Africa to Latin America. In 1908, Indian activists threw British cloth into bonfires in a gesture of economic resistance reminiscent of the tea protest. In more recent years, activists in Europe and Asia have also drawn upon the Boston Tea Party's spirit, not in direct imitation, but in the same key of civil disobedience. There's something about the visual power of that night. The quiet rowboats, the cloaked figures working under moonlight, the cascading crates, that lodges itself into memory. The image is so theatrical, so clear in its moral purpose, that it continues to stir people's imagination. And perhaps that's what makes it endure. It is simple enough to grasp, yet complex enough to wrestle with. Because beneath the pageantry of that December night lies a tangle of tensions, economics and ideology, revolution and restraint, elite interests and popular unrest. It was not, and never has been, a perfect act. It excluded as much as it included. It emerged from real grievances, yes, but also from real privilege. And it left behind stories that are only now being fully uncovered, stories of dock workers and servants, of the enslaved and the invisible, who watched from the edges as history unfolded without asking their permission. I sometimes wonder what those hidden witnesses thought as they saw the Sons of Liberty vanish into the darkness that night. Did they believe it would change everything? Or did it seem like just another burst of noise in a city already rumbling with discontent? Because revolutions don't usually announce themselves with fireworks. They begin quietly, with strange meetings, with missing crates, with angry letters and torn ledgers, with people whose names were never meant to be remembered. But memory has its own strange rhythm, and somehow, over time, even the smallest gesture, like pouring tea into salt water, can become a monument. The Boston Tea Party is one of those rare moments where action met symbolism so perfectly that it became more than a story. It became a mirror, one that each generation holds up to ask itself a simple question. What am I willing to risk for the kind of world I believe in? That question doesn't belong to Boston or to 1773 or even to the American Revolution. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of injustice and wondered if their voice could matter. It belongs to the quiet planners, the messy actors, the uncertain allies. It belongs to people who never made it into the history books, but who carried the weight of protest in their daily lives. So perhaps that is the true legacy of the Boston Tea Party. Not just that it led to war or birthed a nation, but that it taught people how to say no, calmly, clearly, without asking for permission. And once that lesson settles in, it is hard to forget. Even centuries later, it still stirs something. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, for sitting with the old stories and letting them breathe again in the stillness. If you've been listening while drifting off or keeping company while working late, I hope this tale brought you a quiet kind of curiosity. Until the next late night story, take care of yourself. And if you'd like to keep exploring the past together, you can like and subscribe, only if you feel like it. No taxes on that just yet. Good night.